Hello, hello. Hope you guys are doing well. How you doing? Happy Thursday. Let me fix some stuff here. All right. Good to see you all. Let's do a couple of announcements before we get going. One is that I hope you all have just survived the election. We're still counting the votes, but hope you guys are all maintaining your sanity as we kind of wait for all of this to unfold. And let's talk about schedule and a couple things coming up. So we're rapidly entering the final stretch of this semester, as I mentioned the other day in my announcement, and we are right. Well, that's not right. There we go. We're right here on November 5th talking about the politics of sectionalism. Next time we'll be talking about sectionalism continued and Lincoln and disunion and moving forward from there. On next Thursday though is what I wanted to bring to your attention, and that is that the Frederick Douglass book test. Goodness, the Frederick Douglass book test is next Thursday, and that test is not going to be like the test that we've had up to this point. The Frederick Douglass test is going to be short answers rather than essay questions, and I'm not going to give a review for it because I honestly don't think you'll need one. The way it works is that rather than having two long essay questions, the book test is a series of short answer questions, usually about four. So there will be four questions. I think you'll get to choose some. There will be four questions that you'll answer, and I just expect you to write a paragraph about your answer. And obviously you need to use evidence from the book, but I do think that you don't need a big elaborate essay like you do for the unit tests. For the book test, your answers can be shorter. Just limit it, to a good paragraph of information. And since there will be you'll answer four questions. That means that each question's worth 25 points. And it's graded very similarly to the tests, where there will be a scale of, a letter grade scale that you will be watching, or that I will be using to kind of grade, A, B, C, D, F, essentially. And so that's how it'll be graded in a very similar format to the unit tests, except, of course, the questions will be worth 25 points instead of 50 because there's four of them. So that'll be next Thursday. That's what you'll be doing then. And then so from there we're really getting down to the end of the semester. Only a few more lectures to go, plus a discussion about the Civil War and kind of our historical memory of it is on tap as well for the very end of the semester. Then December 8th, or at least the week of, we get to the final. And then we're basically done. So we're rapidly making our way towards the end of the semester, and it seems like we only started just a few days ago. It's amazing how the semester, as we do this remotely, the semesters seem to go both slowly and quickly at the same time. It's like unexplainable. Physics. I don't know, the passage of time, right? So let's go ahead and get into the politics of sectionalism, and we have a lot to cover today about the sectional crisis. And one of the things that I want you to keep in mind as we move through this lecture and future lectures on this subject is that we're talking about the growing division of the nation. And particularly today, we're going to be talking about how the nation is growing more divided politically, right? How the parties are splitting apart, how the nation itself is almost like divided against itself, and how we kind of get to that point where civil war starts to look more and more possible. We have the benefit of hindsight knowing that the Civil War is coming in 1861, but at this point, they don't know that the Civil War is coming, but it's pretty clear the markers are there pointing the way to the Civil War. And it is becoming very evident that compromise is increasingly not an option going forward. We're going to talk about one last compromise today, but overall, it is becoming increasingly clear that compromise is becoming more and more difficult for the people living in the United States at this point. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Hold on just 1 second. Something messed up and I need to fix it. Did that? Oh, no. There we go. Okay. I think we fixed it. Let me check on my stream. Yeah, I think we're good. Yeah, okay. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Sorry about that. We're going to begin with the election of 1848, which is kind of where we left off a little while ago. You know, we talked a lot about, in the last lecture, we talked about westward expansion, Texas, the Mexican-American War. And today we're going to kind of pick right off of that Mexican-American War and talk about, in this one, politics rather than expansion. So in 1848, there are 3 parties running for the presidency here. We'll get to the new party here in a second. That's the Free Soilers. But let's go through each of these candidates and talk about who they are, why they matter or don't matter, and where we're going to go from here. So remember, we're still in the second party system. We got the Whigs and the Democrats. The Democrats are a national party. They have support all over the nation. The Whigs, on the other hand, are a New England party with some support in the South and in like the upper South, like Kentucky and Tennessee, because of Henry Clay. Zachary Taylor is the candidate for the Whigs. You've heard his name before because he was the hero of the Mexican-American War. He was one of the generals that helped win that war. So he was famous, right? He was famous kind of like in some ways, a celebrity choice because he had a lot of popularity because of his actions in the war. Americans love a good war hero, love making war heroes presidents, as evidenced by George Washington, and then obviously into the future. But there are some problems with Zachary Taylor as a presidential candidate for the Whigs in particular. One is that he wasn't really ideologically connected to the Whig cause. Remember, the Whigs believed in that American system. The kind of they were seen as the inheritors of the John Quincy Adams idea of the American system, that we're gonna build up America with internal infrastructure, and we're gonna pump money into the university system and kind of build up America into a world power by internal improvements. Zachary Taylor didn't really buy into that idea. He wasn't really a Whig in that political sense. Plus, Zachary Taylor was from Louisiana. He was an enslaver. He was a slave owner from Louisiana. And that's also a problem because a lot of the people who vote for the Whig Party are from the North, where slavery has been outlawed for years, decades in some places. So Zachary Taylor is kind of an odd choice for the Whigs. The reason why they chose him is because they were a little bit desperate. They needed somebody that they felt could win an election. And so they're like, well, this guy isn't perfect, but we'll pick him anyway. The Democrats ran a guy named Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass is very forgettable. In fact, this is going to be the last time you hear about him in this class and probably for the rest of your life. So say hello to Lewis Cass, and we're going to say goodbye to him here in just a minute. He was very forgettable, but one thing that is notable about Lewis Cass is that he believed and argued in favor of something called popular sovereignty. We'll talk a little bit more about popular sovereignty here in a minute because it's important for the scope of this lecture. But in short, popular sovereignty means giving people the right to vote on an issue. Particularly in this case, we're talking about slavery. As people expand west and create new states, there wasn't really a system. Like we had the Missouri Compromise system that was designated to figure out whether a state was going to be a slave state or a non-slave state. And Lewis Cass argued that we should get rid of that system and instead let people vote on it in those new states. It's controversial. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But Lewis Cass, pretty uninspiring dude, pretty forgettable. He's not going to win this election. Martin Van Buren is the other guy. Now, this is interesting. Martin Van Buren is actually a former president, right? He was the 8th president, right after Andrew Jackson. And notably, he is not running as a Democrat, which is pretty surprising because Martin Van Buren was once a Democrat. He's the guy who literally built the Democratic Party. But he had some splits with the Democrats. He did not leave the party on good terms, founded his own party called the Free Soil Party, or at least joined up with the Free Soilers. This is a new party. One thing that needs to be stated right off the bat about this party is that they are not an abolitionist party. A lot of people think that because they have the word free in there, that they are a party that's devoted to the end of slavery, and that is not the case. The Free Soilers argued that slavery should not be allowed to expand. They were against the expansion of slavery. And you might think, well, that's good, right? That's a good thing because you don't want slavery to expand. But it's not for a moral reason. The Free Soilers weren't moral abolitionists like, William Lloyd Garrison. Instead, the Free Soilers were worried about the white working class. People like Martin Van Buren and others in the Free Soil Party argued that slavery harmed the white working class because by depressing wages, because people would just, if you needed more workers, people in the South just purchased more enslaved people. And so Martin Van Buren and others they came up with this concept that we need free soil, free land, right? The idea that we need to have areas that are free soil for white labor. Because they argued that the wage labor system, the wage labor system of free men working on free land, was superior to the system of slavery that was implemented in the South. And so they're kind of like basing this on the American dream of the average Northerner, people who wanted cheap land and they didn't want to have to compete with the labor of enslaved peoples. So again, this is not an abolitionist party, and in fact, it is a party that is dedicated to benefiting white laborers by kind of preventing the expansion of slavery. So the Free Soilers occupy a really interesting position in American life here. And the results, though, are that the Free Soilers aren't that popular nationally. They have a pretty small following. Van Buren, and if you remember, Van Buren, not exactly an inspiring figure like Andrew Jackson, only gets 10% of the vote. Right? So they only get 10%. But as a third party, getting 10% can affect an election, and in this case it does. Because the Democrats were actually pretty popular in a state like New York. But the Free Soilers siphon enough of those Democratic votes to give that state to the Whigs, which allows, it's not the entire reason, but it's a large reason why the Whigs and Zachary Taylor win this election. And this is important because what this shows is that the electoral system and many of the political contests that we're having from this point forward are all going to revolve around slavery in some fashion. In this case, it's a whole new party that has arisen to try to prevent the expansion of slavery because they're trying to protect the interests of the white working class. Additionally, before we move on to the Compromise of 1850, one thing I want to note here, look at all this big unorganized territory out here. This is going to play a key role in this election, is all this territory out here. Now, this area right here that I'm kind of circling with my mouse is Oklahoma, modern-day Oklahoma. Back then, it was basically Indian territory. They had carved it up and created various reservations for Indian tribes like the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Creek. But there's a lot of this unorganized territory that people are going to start moving into, and that's going to become incredibly important as we move forward through this lecture. Is like what's going to happen with this unorganized territory right here. Also, another thing to note: look how big Texas is. Like Texas is absolutely enormous, right? The normal Texas, you cut this off and you go down here and then you cut it right here. They got this whole like appendage up here on like the northwestern portion. That's going to have to be trimmed off. And that's actually going to be somewhat controversial. We'll talk about that. So as we move forward, we have a Whig in power who's not really dedicated to doing Whig things. And the controversy over the expansion of slavery has reached all the way to national politics, right? This is something that everybody's concerned about. North, South. The North obviously doesn't want slavery to expand, and the South clearly does. By the time we get to 1850, there's a lot of issues that need to be resolved. And so for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about what's going on in 1850 and what the politicians are going to try to do about them, or at least like maybe what they can do about them. One is that California, out on the West Coast, all of a sudden is a petitioning for statehood. California is an interesting place because it was already settled by the Spanish and then later the Mexican empires. There were lots of people already living in California even before the Americans took it over after the Mexican-American War, particularly along the coastline right here. When the Spanish settled this area, they created this series of missions right here. And so California, even when the Americans took it over, had a high population of Latinos and was also a already populous area. And then it became even more populated in 1848 when people discovered gold. In 1848 and 1849, the discovery of gold led hundreds of thousands of people to go from the east to the west. I'm talking hundreds of thousands of people, and seemingly overnight, California goes from a quiet frontier state to a booming frontier state with all of these different boom towns, all these people moving around, and all of a sudden it seems like California is ready for statehood almost overnight. And what's interesting about this is because it's not even connected to the rest of the country, right? All of these are just territories right here in this kind of mid-region of the country. California's out there by itself, but it's ready for statehood because of how many people live there now. But there's a problem with California. It's not as simple as just admitting California into the Union. There's actually a couple of problems with California. One is that California is divided in half by the 3630 line. You can see this is the 3630 line right here that was created by the Missouri Compromise. And remember, the compromise was that everything below this 3630 line was intended to be a slave state, and everything above the 3630 line was going to be a free state. That was how the compromise was written in 1820. But California complicates this, because California is a big state, and the 3630 line divides it literally in half. So what do you do with it? Do you actually divide it in half? If you admit it as a free state or a slave state, you risk upsetting the balance in Congress. Congress was balanced at 15 and 15. So if it comes in as a free state, now free states have an advantage, 16 to 15. Same thing if it comes in as a slave state. And so this is a decision that has a high consequence, right? Whichever side California goes, and it was definitely leaning towards a free state, it's going to give that side a big advantage. And California is also a massive state. So if it comes in as a free state, not only does that give the free states more power in the Senate, but eventually a lot of power in the House of Representatives too, just by the sheer magnitude of how many people are going to end up living in California. So that's one problem, is what to do about California in 1850. Another problem has to do with the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., which is over here, the total other side of the nation. Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, still operated a slave trading port. Remember, the international slave trade at this point has been shut off in the United States, but there was still a robust domestic slave trade, meaning that people still traded slaves domestically within the United States. And Washington, D.C. had big slave trading yards, essentially. You could literally walk just a couple of blocks from the House of Representatives, from Congress, and you would find slave jails and auctions where people were being bought and sold. And this created Northerners hated this, because for them, the North depicted themselves as the more sophisticated, the more advanced, the more progressive part of the country, because they had abolished slavery. And the fact that slavery not only still existed in the nation's capital, but that the slave trade was allowed to continue in the nation's capital, for them was a mark of embarrassment. They would complain that Northerners would complain that diplomats from other countries would come over to the United States and ask to be to be taken to the slave jails. Like, hey, show us the slave auctions where you guys like buy and sell other human beings. Almost as like, for the North, it became a sign of America's backwardness. And so they wanted to get rid of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Of course, the South did not. So, that's a conflict that's going on in 1850. Another conflict that's going on has to do with fugitive slaves. During the 1840s and 1850s, you see an uptick of slaves particularly from this upper South region right here, escaping to the North. And here's the thing. The North, according to the Constitution, was supposed to send fugitive slaves back to the South. But they didn't. They didn't. The North generally let fugitive slaves, once they escape to the North, just be free people and, get a job and kind of like just live in the North. And this really angered the South because Southerners argued, remember that the Southern conceptualization of property rights is entirely bound up in the idea of owning somebody else as a piece of property. And so for Southerners, this meant that an escaped slave was literally a loss of money. And so they were really angry that the North just didn't bother trying to catch fugitive slaves. And this led to a lot of tension between northern and southern states, particularly right here along the border of like the border between the slave and non-slave states. We'll talk about what to do with that. The last conflict is what to do about Texas. Now, this is the normal shape of Texas that you and I know in the modern day, but I showed you what Texas looked like a minute ago, and it was all huge, and that was a problem. The South wanted Texas to be trimmed down to a more appropriate size. And part of the reason why is because if you trim down Texas, because that extra bit extended into New Mexico and all the way up into Colorado, if you trim Texas down, you all of a sudden create new space for more potential slave states. So there's a lot of things that need to be decided. There's a lot of conflict going on within the nation. And what it's going to take is a compromise. Very similar to what happens with the Missouri Compromise, Henry Clay literally comes out of retirement. At this point, Henry Clay was quite old, and he comes out of retirement to make this thing work. Zachary Taylor, who was the president at the time, actually passes away. He was quite old and ill. He was 65 years old when he gets elected, and that actually brings in a new president whose name was Millard Fillmore. And if you're thinking at home, I've never even heard of that guy, that's okay. Millard Fillmore only serves as like 2 years as president and then basically gets dumped by his own party, which is kind of funny. We'll talk about that in a minute. But Millard Fillmore was more willing to let the states compromise. Zachary Taylor wasn't super interested in compromising about the issues of slavery and about the other problems that were going on in the Union. Millard Fillmore is going to allow this compromise to take place. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, the former war hawk, one of the most famous speakers of the House, the guy who lost the presidency like 4 different times, he's going to, it was either 3 or 4, he's going to get this compromise passed. And here's the thing about the compromise of 1850 is that there are parts that the South liked and parts that the North liked, things that they fought for. So let's look at, I have them written down here on the screen for you. And let's talk about the things that the North wanted and then what the South wanted. The first 2 are things that the North wanted. California is allowed to enter the nation as a free state. So you can see that it has been designated as a free state according to the tabulations. This is a huge moment for the free states. They now control the Senate 16-15, and in fact will never relinquish that control. By the time we get to the Civil War, there are more free states than slave states. California is kind of the beginning of the tip in that direction. So California enters the nation as a free state. Another thing that the North wanted was they wanted the slave trade abolished in Washington, D.C., and they get it. The South agrees to give in and abolish the slave trade. Now, not slavery itself. Slavery itself is still allowed in Washington, but the slave trade is gotten rid of. The next 2 things are things that the South wanted. The South wanted the Fugitive Slave Clause strengthened, meaning they wanted to force the North to send back escaped slaves. And the way they did this in our modern day seems like so ridiculous. But let me explain to you how they forced the North to send back escaped slaves. The way they did it was, if a person in the North, a black man or woman, was accused of being a fugitive slave, it was brought before a special court that was created to hear these things. And so a judge would be assigned to decide whether or not this person was a escaped slave or not. And the judge was paid based on his decision in these court cases. So, for example, if a person came before the judge and the judge decided that this black man could be a free person, was not an escaped slave, and should be allowed to live in the North, the judge would be paid $5. If the judge decided against that person and ordered that black man to be sent back to the South, saying that he was an escaped slave, the judge would be paid double. The judge would be paid $10. And so it enforces this, it encourages the North to actually send escaped slaves back, and even sometimes people who weren't even slaves would get caught up in this system, because all you had to do was accuse somebody of being a potentially escaped slave, and then they might get sent back to the South, and you might be able to make money on this. And for a lot of Northerners, this was really problematic. Many Northerners really hated the strengthened fugitive slave clause, because they felt like it made them slave catchers, to use their words. They felt like it kind of made them complicit in this system of slavery. And really, to be honest, the North was already complicit because their economy relied on the cheap cotton from the South, but that's a conversation for a different time. The other thing the South wanted is that they got Texas's boundary pushed back. This is what Texas looked like after the Compromise of 1850, and you can see that its boundary has been shaved off tremendously. It had included all of this stuff up here, so they got their boundary trimmed back a little bit. The thing at the bottom, the fifth thing on this list, is something that both sides agreed on, which is the idea of popular sovereignty in the Western territories. And particularly when I say Western territories, I mean this big unorganized territory right here that we will soon know as Kansas and Nebraska. What popular sovereignty meant here was that the people who lived in this unorganized territory, the people who were going to make this territory into a new state, will get to vote on the issue of slavery. Popular sovereignty. Sovereignty means to rule. Popular meaning the people, right? What the people want. And so it's basically saying people power, right? The people are going to choose how to rule themselves. And in this case, we're talking specifically about the issue of slavery. That is going to be the hot button issue when it comes to popular sovereignty. Now, the Compromise of 1850 is a true compromise. There were parts of it that both sides hated, right? It is a true compromise. In particular, like I said, the North hated the Fugitive Slave Clause. They really disliked the fact that they are being kind of roped into the system of slavery when many of the northern states had already abolished slavery, either gradually or immediately. Also keep in mind that California being admitted as a free state just straight up violates the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise stipulated that the 3630 line, that everything above it was supposed to be free and everything below it was supposed to be slave territory, and California's just over here ignoring that. And what that means is that the Missouri Compromise is on its last legs. And pretty soon, the Missouri Compromise is going to cease to exist. And that's important because, and we'll talk about why here in just a moment. In the next election, the election of 1852, this is the one where Millard Fillmore gets jettisoned by his own party, which is absolutely amazing. We have two guys running, Franklin Pierce, Winfield Scott. Pierce is the Democrat, Winfield Scott is the Whig. And the reason why I say it's so funny is because Millard Fillmore was the Whig president, right? He had been the vice president for Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor dies. Millard Fillmore takes over and finishes out Zachary Taylor's term. And then when it comes to the election of 1852, his own party doesn't run him. He's the president. Can you imagine? like his own party is just like, no. We'd rather have this dude run instead of you. Just like, yikes. So we got Franklin Pierce and Winfield Scott running for president here. Winfield Scott was a war hero, very similar to Zachary Taylor. He had been a war hero in the Mexican-American War, and he was so popular, in fact, or at least so well known. That's one of the reasons why they chose him over Millard Fillmore, was because they felt like Winfield Scott stood a better chance of winning. Fillmore also had made himself unpopular with the Northern Whigs, because remember, Fillmore was the guy that signed off on the Compromise of 1850, and so a lot of those Northerners were angry about the Fugitive Slave Clause, and they blamed Millard Fillmore because he's been the guy that ultimately signed off on it. Winfield Scott is relatively anti-slavery, or at least anti-expansion of slavery. Franklin Pierce, on the other hand, is a Democrat. He is a Northern Democrat, notably. So he's from the North, which means that he's not quite as vehemently pro-slavery as Southerners are, but he's able to he has those connections with the South because of his party affiliation. And in fact, Franklin Pierce is very skeptical of the whole abolition thing. He thinks abolition is a threat to the nation, and in fact runs on a platform that says that the Compromise of 1850 is basically the last time we're going to have to talk about the slavery thing. That was a very wrong assertion. In this election, Pierce ultimately wins. It becomes a contest of personalities, just who can turn out votes more than the other guy. Franklin Pierce is able to win this contest partially because the Whigs were so badly divided. Many of the Northern Whigs were angry at Millard Fillmore for signing the Compromise of 1850, turned away from their party, or didn't even vote, and that allowed, or voted for the Free Soilers, who were still around. Not much, but they were still there, hanging out. Note that the Whigs still control Kentucky, Tennessee because of Henry Clay. But what we're seeing here is that the Whig party is getting battered pretty badly. They are a divided party. You have this northern segment that is devoted to preventing the expansion of slavery, if not, in some cases, being abolitionists. And then you get the southern kind of part of the party that's a little bit more, that's more dedicated to slavery. I mean, Henry Clay himself was a slave owner. And pretty soon, the Whig party is going to rupture and break apart and kind of fall apart. But it's going to take an important event, and that important event is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So here we go. Kansas-Nebraska is this big territory we saw just a minute ago, right there. And Kansas and Nebraska were seen as pivotal to westward expansion. Because if you think about it, I mean, they're right in the center of the country. If you want to get to the west, you got to pass through this territory. I mean, unless you wanted to dip all the way down through the deep south. But regardless, you've got to go through this middle of the country territory if you want to get to the West Coast. And making matters more intense, or at least more important, is that they were planning a transcontinental railroad. There still, at this point, was not a railroad that connected the East Coast to the West Coast, and they were starting to plan it. People wanted to build a railroad, but there were a lot of questions about where that railroad was going to go. Where does it begin? Does it begin in New York? Does it begin in Boston? Does it go all the way up to Maine? Where is it going to end? Does it end in San Francisco, Los Angeles? But more particularly, what's the route? Is it going to go through this Midwest right here and over? Or is it going to go all the way down through the Deep South and over? These are key questions. And Stephen Douglas, I don't have his picture up here, but you'll learn a little bit more about him a little bit later. Stephen Douglas was a congressman from Illinois. Illinois is right here. Douglas was a famous politician, one of those guys that was known for being an incredible speaker and just intellectual. And he wanted the Transcontinental Railroad to go through his state. He wanted it to begin up here somewhere in the Northeast and then travel down this way and stop in Chicago and then move to the West. But in order for it to do that, yawns. In order for him to do that, they need to settle this territory. Stephen Douglas realizes that in order to build that railroad from the Northeast all the way over here to the West Coast, this territory has to be settled. And mostly the people that lived there at this point in time were Native Americans. And this like kind of middle of the country area right here, you've got the Comanche, who still controlled this large territory right here. The Dakota were all up in this region. You got the Cheyenne and the Kiowa, who were down here in kind of like Oklahoma and Kansas. Those are all four of those tribes were incredibly warlike, difficult to displace, in some cases incredibly violent. And so there was this sense that we need to settle this land, right? We need to push those Native Americans out and start settling this territory. The problem here is that Kansas as a territory is above the 3630 line, right? So according to the Missouri Compromise, Kansas should be a free state, a free territory. But Douglas wants to avoid any sort of arguments over the issue of slavery. He doesn't want it to just be a free state. Instead, because at this point we've had three systems of deciding whether or not a state is going to permit slavery. You know, like these states right here, this Northwest Territory, operated under an exclusive idea where like there was no slavery there, and it wasn't even an option. They were just free states, and that was it. We've had the Missouri Compromise, which like kind of divided the state regionally, you know, by geography. And now, as Stephen Douglas is arguing, we should give these territories popular sovereignty. We should allow the people who are moving into Kansas and are moving into Nebraska the chance to vote on the issue of slavery. And so he creates a law to do this. Stephen Douglas creates the Kansas-Nebraska Act to create these two territories and to decide what's going to happen with them. So what the Kansas-Nebraska, it does two important things, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. One is that it straight up repeals the 3630 line. So that big 3630 line that went all up right here is now repealed, non-existent. It's gone. The second thing that the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it institutes popular sovereignty for these territories. So anything that gets any state that gets created out of these territories will be the issue of slavery will be decided by popular sovereignty. The people will vote on it. This bill gets implemented. Franklin Pierce signs it. The South was incredibly in favor of this. 90% of Southern congressmen favored the Kansas-Nebraska Act because they were excited. For the South, this was the first chance since 1820 almost that they had the opportunity to expand slavery. And many of the Southerners wanted to expand slavery. They hoped to expand slavery into these new territories. The North, on the other hand, was furious. Only about 60% of Northern congressmen voted in favor of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it barely passed. Franklin Pierce signed it, as I mentioned, but the North is furious because for them, many Northerners had grown up, almost an entire generation and a half, had grown up with the idea that the 3630 line was always going to keep the country separated, that slavery was always going to be a problem down in the South, and the North wasn't going to have to deal with it. And in fact, the North referred to the 3630 line as the so-called sacred pledge. It was this thing that had existed, and they thought it was going to be immutable, just never changing, right? That it was always going to be there, dividing the country in half and kind of protecting the North from the expansiveness or the expansion tendencies of the South. And the fact that it gets pulled away, and now there's this possibility that slavery could expand into the northern areas, these old New England states are frightened by this, because if these territories get turned into slave states, that's more power for the slave states in government. And the fact that this Kansas-Nebraska Act gets passed in 1854, it absolutely destroys part of the political system. The Whig Party basically just doesn't vanish, but it disintegrates. Because the Whig Party, as I mentioned earlier, is heavily divided between the North and the South. They're already struggling to kind of keep themselves together. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act really brings that sectional problem to the forefront, right? It really distills the problems between the North and the South into one event in a way. And the Whigs, which was a party that claimed a large support structure up here in the North, but still had some support down here in places like Tennessee and Kentucky, the Whig Party simply couldn't withstand the pressure that was brought to bear by the idea of slavery being put up to a vote. There were some Whigs that abhorred that idea and others that supported it, and the party just kind of splinters apart. What starts to happen is in the South, the Democrats consolidate their power. The South is going to increasingly become a Democratic stronghold. The North, during this era, during the mid-1850s, 1854, 1855, the North, the Whig Party shrivels. It eventually is going to just disintegrate into nothing, and a new party will emerge because there's a power vacuum now. There's all these people who want a new political party, and a new one will emerge, known as the Republican Party. But there are a lot of divisions in the United States, not just with the Whigs, but just in general. The United States at this point, at this moment in time, was incredibly divided. Let's talk about some of those divisions and what's going on in the United States. One of the divisions is that the North is much more industrially advanced than the South. The North is more economically developed than the South. You can just look at this as a map of all the railroads that existed by the year 1860. And you can see that the North is incredibly advanced and industrial. Massachusetts is just a nest of railroads. And look at all these different railroads stretching, and they're all interconnected, right? All stretching all throughout the Midwest region right here, as we would call this area, all the way up into this New England region. This is a good example of how the North is industrial. They've been pumping money into their infrastructure. They are interconnected via railroad and roads and these sorts of things. The South, on the other hand, is lagging behind. Right? The North has pivoted to this industrial economy. The South, on the other hand, is lagging behind. They are still relying on their agrarian economy that has existed for hundreds of years at this point. They have some railroads, but many of them aren't even connected to anything. Right? Look at Texas. I love this guy. I don't know what this guy's doing right here. But Texas has a couple of railroad systems, but they're not connected. Look at this guy right here. Again, Louisiana, Mississippi, these weird little railroads not connected. Florida has a couple of railroads. Georgia has one that's not connected to anything. Once you get kind of into the older South, you get some connectivity, right? Some connections to the North. But by and large, the South is kind of isolated. The North is incredibly connected, and the South is just not quite. It's not there. It's not as industrial. It's not as they haven't been putting money into their infrastructure system. And what this means is that these railroads make northern cities like the center of production. So the economy in the North is largely focused on these big urban areas like Chicago or Massachusetts or New York or Philadelphia, whereas the South there are cities, of course, places like Charlotte and Charleston, but the South is much more rural, much more agriculturally driven. It's not nearly as industrial or as urban as the North, right? Southerners are almost all rural. Another distinction between the North and the South has to do with the way their population demographics are, the way the demographics of their population. There we go. In the North, the big quote-unquote minority population was immigrants, people from Scotland and Ireland, England, Scandinavia, Germany. Lots of people from Northern and Western Europe. Those people, crammed into the big cities, and were often, particularly the Irish, were often viewed as the lowest people on the social totem pole. Right? They were the lowest rung on the social ladder, so to speak. In the South, though, not so many immigrants, but certainly a lot of enslaved people. And those enslaved people occupied the lowest rung on the ladder in the South. So both regions of the country have a kind of a lower underclass. In the North, it's immigrants. In the South, it's enslaved people. Another division between the North and the South at this moment in time is Northerners have public education. And it's free. You could just as a regular average person, you could gain a public education and be a literate person. In the South, education was the realm of the wealthy. There was no public education in the South. If you wanted to get an education, you needed to hire a private tutor or go to private school. And that meant that education was really reserved for the wealthy. Right? Only wealthy people could afford to get an education. So that meant that the vast majority of the South was uneducated, illiterate, and largely ignorant of things going on in the wider world around them. Not always, but a lot of the time. So all of these divisions are going to, and the differences in how the South is living versus how the North is living is going to lead to the creation of the third party system. Remember, the first party system, we've had 3 so far, and only 3 in American history. The first party system was the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. The second party system, which we just finished a minute ago, was the Whigs versus the Democrats. The third party system, which is the one we're going to talk about right now, is the Republicans, who are a new party, versus the Democrats, and there's also a small party called the Know Nothings, but we'll talk about them in a minute. Republicans are a new party. This is the same Republican Party that exists today. That's the reason why there's no fourth party system. It's just the third because still the 2 parties in our modern day are the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republican Party almost came into existence overnight. It was a party that at first, it's a northern party, a party that pulled from the ranks of the northern Whigs, some northern Democrats. Republicans also believed in one thing that I think bears mentioning before we go further is that Republicans were not an abolitionist party. Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. Now, he didn't believe that slavery should expand, so he was like a free soiler, but he was not an abolitionist. What Republicans believed, though, was that enslavers in the South held too much political power. They believed that the big slave owners in the South had far too much power compared to their population. And in some ways they were right, because the large plantation owners in the South did have a large amount of control over their southern states, and then that control extended into the federal government. And so the Republicans were very distrustful of the power of what would become the slaveocracy, right? The power of that the planter class. Many Northern Democrats are going to join the Republican Party, and the Republican Party really becomes the South's greatest fear. It's a genuine Yankee party, a party entirely composed of Northerners. They are an anti-slavery party, although again not an abolitionist party, but an anti-slavery party. They oppose the expansion of slavery, and they're entirely from the North. It's like the Southerners' worst fear realized. The Know Nothings, on the other, the Democrats are largely the same. They believe in popular sovereignty. The big difference, the problem for the Democrats is that they kind of split on slavery's expansion. There are Northern Democrats who didn't want slavery to expand, and Southerners who did. And so the Democratic Party is still a very national party. It still has Northern and Southern elements to it. The Know Nothings are a party that existed almost entirely in the big cities in the North. They're also called the American Party. That's their official name, was the American Party. And you may be wondering, why the hell are they called the Know Nothings? And it's because supposedly when you would ask a supporter about the party, they were supposed to say, "I know nothing," like it's Fight Club or something. You're not supposed to talk about it. But in particular, The Know-Nothings didn't like immigration. They were anti-Catholic. They believed that Catholics were kind of polluting America's religious heritage. They were like staunchly Protestant. They were also anti-slavery, and it's not because, again, it's not a morality thing, but it's out of concern for the white working class, very similar to kind of like the Free Soil Party. They were very popular in the big cities up in the Northeast, Boston, New York, places like that. So these are going to be the parties going forward. And we'll talk a little bit more about them as we get to the election of 1856. But before we get there, we have to talk about what's going on in Kansas still. By the time you get to the mid-1850s, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act gets passed, my goodness, I don't know why I'm yawning so much. It's the election, man. I actually know it's the election. I'm just tired. I've been watching election results just like constantly. As a political historian, I feel like it's my job, you know. So in Kansas, remember, slavery, the issue of slavery was being decided by popular sovereignty. So people were going to get the right to vote on whether or not Kansas was going to be a slave state or a free state. Prior to 1850, Kansas was a small area. Nobody lived there, right? It was very small settlements, squatters like hanging out on farms they didn't even own. After 1850, though, and especially after the passage of Kansas-Nebraska, it turns into a conflict. Who can get more of their supporters into the state? Northerners are going to start moving to Kansas to try to influence the outcome of the election. They're going to start moving to Kansas in an effort to try to create a large community of free state supporters. On the other hand, people in Missouri who are pro-slavery are going to come across the border and vote illegally in the election to try to sway, to try to affect the election and make Kansas a slave state. And so Kansas becomes like this testing ground. It's like an experiment. Does popular sovereignty work? Can we give people the right to vote on the issue of slavery, and will it work out? And the answer is not really. Not really. Because what does happen? So they put it up for a vote. They're like, all right, 1855, we're going to put it up for a vote. You got y'all tell us what, slavery, yes or no. It's up for election. And so what happens is the Northerners who had moved to Kansas, are obviously going to vote for a free state. They have pretty large numbers, and they're voting legally, like they live in Kansas. But many people from Missouri cross the border and hang out for a day or two, cast illegal ballots, and then go back across the border. These people were referred to as border ruffians because they were acting illegally. And this leads to a fraudulent election. So in 1855, let me give you an example of what I mean by fraudulent. In 1855, they did a census of a particular county in, I believe, eastern Kansas, and there was 2,900 voters, so 2,900 eligible voters in that particular county of Kansas. Then when the vote happened, all of a sudden, 6,300 votes were cast, which is like triple the amount, it's double the amount of voters. Like, how does this happen? Well, the way it happens is the people cheated. Right? People cheated. The pro-slavery forces in particular were committing election fraud. Right? They were, or at the very least, voter fraud. They were voting in an election that they were not eligible to vote in. But what happens, though, is that the pro-slavery forces win this election because they cheated, and then they use the fact that they won this election as a way to say, we are the legitimate leaders of Kansas, and Kansas is going to be a slave state. So the pro-slavery forces use this fraudulent election as a way to claim power. And of course, the Free Soilers, right, the anti-slavery forces are like, no, this is BS. Like, you can't do that. And they form their own government in the summer. And so by the time you get to 1856, you have two governments in Kansas. You have one that has adopted a pro-slavery constitution, And you have another that is an anti-slavery rebellion trying to argue that they are actually the true government of Kansas. By the spring of 1856, you essentially have a civil war happening in Kansas as the free Kansas government and the pro-slavery government are literally fighting and killing each other. And this moment where you have a state that's not even created yet, Kansas hasn't even been made into a state yet people are there fighting over the issue of slavery. It's a microcosm. It's an example of what the Civil War looks like. It shows how divided American society was over the issue of slavery at this point in time. And in fact, people were paying attention to this, very close attention. What was going on in Kansas had far-reaching ramifications all the way up to Washington, D.C., the capital. Charles Sumner. I'm going to tell you a story. Charles Sumner was a senator. He was from Massachusetts. He was a Republican. That's what these letters right here mean. He's a Republican from Massachusetts. Charles Sumner was a radical abolitionist. He believed that slavery was morally wrong and that it needed to be abolished right away. So for him, it was a moral crusade, very similar to like the William Lloyd Garrisons of the world. And Sumner was one of the few real abolitionists in the Senate. There weren't many of them. The Senate, particularly because obviously the people who hail from the slave states aren't going to be abolitionists, and even amongst the Northerners, there weren't that many abolitionists, like true abolitionists in the Senate. He was one of the few. And so in March of 1856, as Kansas has kind of descended into warfare, civil war in Kansas, as it's known, Bleeding Kansas, Sumner gets up in front of all of his Senate colleagues and gives a speech. It's a 6-hour-long speech, which I'm tired just thinking about that. And in this speech, he talks about a lot of different stuff. He talks about, Republican principles and the free soil movement, abolition, but in particular, he talks about the slaveholder conspiracy, right? The Republican conceptualization that enslavers have too much power in the American political system. And the thing is, not only does he talk about the power of like the planter class, but he also makes attacks on individual slave owners themselves. Like he's up there in front of the Senate naming names, talking trash directly to their faces in some cases. In fact, one guy that he singles out is a fellow senator, a dude named Andrew Butler. He was a senator from South Carolina. And Charles Sumner singles out Andrew Butler. Andrew Butler was a slave owner, and Sumner accused Andrew Butler of fathering children with one of his slaves, which was a huge taboo back in this time period. Now, historians know today, and it was known back then too, that slave owners would regularly sexually assault their slaves, their female slaves, raping them in an effort to get them pregnant, to force them to have kids, because that was a way to create new slaves. This is something that we know happened. But people didn't talk about it, right? It was considered impolite, I suppose, to talk about the fathering of mixed-race children in the South. That was seen as a huge taboo in Southern culture. And here's Charles Sumner basically spilling the tea in the Senate, right, in front of everybody. Whether or not it was true, like it's just like it's like the audacity, right? Like Sumner's up here just talking this trash. And during this speech, the gallery is filled. People the room is full of people listening. And a guy named Preston Brooks is there. Preston Brooks was the nephew of Andrew Butler. So he was the nephew of that South Carolina senator that Sumner was trash talking. And Preston Brooks was furious. And Preston Brooks wasn't just a nobody. He was actually a congressman too. He wasn't a senator, but a member of the House. And he was from South Carolina as well. And he decides there in that moment, as Charles Sumner is sullying his family's name, he gets like, I'm going to get my revenge. Now, most of the time when you think of like revenge stories like this, you might think of like dueling, right? You go up and slap somebody with a glove and you're like, I'll see you at high noon kind of thing. But dueling was illegal at this point and highly frowned upon. The whole Hamilton and Andrew Burr thing, not a great look, right? You don't want to do that. And so instead, Preston Brooks went to Plan B, which was just to literally beat Charles Sumner's ass. I'm serious. Preston Brooks, so there, one day, in a few weeks later, after Sumner had given his speech, Sumner is in the Senate, literally signing copies of his speech. He's at his desk, signing copies of his speech and mailing them off to his supporters. Preston Brooks rolls in with a cane with a gold knob tip on it and literally starts wailing on Charles Sumner. He beat him so badly that Charles Sumner fell unconscious and had health problems for the rest of his life as a result of this beating. Preston Brooks was literally trying to kill him. Sumner was hospitalized for weeks after this attack. And both the framing of this moment is really interesting because this certainly happened, but the North took this as an example of how the South couldn't be reasoned with, right? That Charles Sumner hadn't physically attacked anybody. Sure, he had maligned the honor of Andrew Butler, but he hadn't attacked anybody. And here is Preston Brooks not using his words, but instead clubs, right? As it says right here, Southern chivalry, argument versus clubs, right? In this case, argument meaning Charles Sumner's just using his words and the South resorts to violence. And note, you can see in the background all these smiling, jeering faces. And so part of the story went, and this is the story that the North told, and it's hard to know exactly how true this is, but the story that gets told is that Northerners tried to go help Charles Sumner not get beaten up by Preston Brooks, but that Southern senators held them back and were smiling and laughing as Preston Brooks beat up on poor Charles Sumner. And you're like, Preston Brooks I feel like I'm not underscoring how insane this is. Preston Brooks is a member of Congress. This is a man who has been elected as a politician, literally trying to beat to death another elected official. It's absolutely insane. It would be like if Nancy Pelosi marched into the Senate and started beating up Mitch McConnell. It's that insane, right? It's just what is happening here? And what's crazy is that, and this to me is the one of the things that makes this story just absolutely bonkers. Preston Brooks realizes that what he's done is wrong, right? He's like, I shouldn't have done that. And so he resigns. He goes back. He goes home to South Carolina and resigns and is like, I realize what I did was messed up. I'm sorry. If you want me to still be your congressman, you can vote for me again, but I'm resigning right now. And in the next when they had a special election to fill his seat, he got reelected by massive margins. And not only that, Preston Brooks received over 100 canes in the mail from supporters. Just literally people being like, yeah, go do that again, right? Keep beating up on those Yanks. Violence in Congress gets so bad that there are Connecticut politicians that when they're leaving to go back to Washington, D.C., their supporters are handing them guns and being like, good luck. Good luck dealing with the South. And so what we're seeing here is a brutal illustration of how compromise is just growing more and more impossible. Yes, we just had the Compromise of 1850, but just a few short years later, you have incidents like this that show that compromise is becoming just farther and farther out of reach. Compromise over the issue of slavery, I mean. There was fighting in Kansas, now there's fighting in the Senate. And there's a great quote by a newspaper man whose name was William Cullen Bryant. He was a writer for the New York Evening Post. And I love this quote because he's talking about violence and how violence is becoming a marker of American political life during this era. And he says, "A violence reigns in the streets of Washington. Violence has now found its way into the Senate chamber. Violence lies in wait all over the navigable rivers and all the railways of Missouri to obstruct those who pass from the free states into Kansas. Violence overhangs the frontiers of that territory like a storm cloud charged with hail and lightning. Violence has carried election after election in that territory. The North, in short, violence is the order of the day. The North is to be pushed to the wall by it, and this plot will succeed if the people of the free states are as apathetic as the slaveholders are insolent." And I love this quote because he's detailing all the violence that's been going on. He's saying violence is preventing people from the free states going into Kansas. Violence hangs over Kansas like a storm, and it's carried election after election, talking about like the fraudulent elections in Kansas. And he says violence is the order of the day. It's the thing that is, it's what is dominating our political life right now. And he's calling out to his fellow Northerners here. He says, the North is to be pushed to the wall by it, like being slammed up against the wall by some angry Southerners. And he's like, and they're going to succeed if we are apathetic, right? If we don't care, those insolent slaveholders are going to do whatever they want because they're willing to be violent. It's a great quote, so vivid. And the thing is, though, there were Northerners who were willing to be violent too. So in Kansas, during the Bleeding Kansas 1856, some pro-slavery forces had burned down the capital of the anti-slavery forces, which was Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence, Kansas which is a big city nowadays, where the University of Kansas is. But back in this time period, Lawrence, Kansas was the capital of like the anti-slavery forces. And a pro-slavery group went in there, burned part of it to the ground, and killed 6 people, killed 6 anti-slavery people. John Brown was one of the men down there fighting for the anti-slavery forces. He'd been down there for some time. And let's talk a little bit about who John Brown is, because it's always, I think, better to understand who this guy is. It'll make a little bit more sense, I think, if you do. John Brown is originally from Connecticut, but he kind of lived all over the place. And he was a deeply religious man. He believed very much in abolition. He was a radical abolitionist, that slaves need, that we need to end slavery right now for moral reasons. And he was a believer in like Old Testament law, the kind that, if you harm me, I'm going to harm you back, right? The eye for an eye often is a misunderstood adage, but in this case, it like that idea that if you come for me, like I'm going to hurt you, I'm going to harm you as well. That vindictive nature of the Old Testament God, John Brown kind of embodied this. And he was truly a radical, more radical than William Lloyd Garrison. Right, you could even call John Brown an extremist, or as H.W. Brands, who's a historian, calls him a zealot. John Brown believed that committing violence against pro-slavery forces was justified. That you could commit violence against pro-slavery forces because they were committing violence against black people. Right? John Brown looked at slavery as an active form of violence against black people. He's not wrong. But his argument was that because that is already a state of war, we can just kill pro-slavery forces because they are already at war with us. And he really hated the abolitionist societies of the North because he argued that they didn't do anything, right? And you get hit this quote right here. He's like, these men are all talk, right? What we need is action, right? We need people who are willing to go in there and get their hands dirty. So John Brown's in Kansas. And while he's in Kansas, he hears about the caning of Charles Sumner. Roughly around the same time, he hears about the burning of the city of Lawrence. And John Brown is absolutely outraged. He is outraged that someone would be so brazen as to attack Charles Sumner in the Senate. And he vowed revenge to get even with those pro-slavery forces. So he and his sons, like I said, are in Kansas. They're fighting with a group called the Kansas Free State Army. You don't need to know who that is, but the Kansas Free State Army. They're camped out with them, and one night, when they're camped out along the Pottawatomie Creek, John Brown and his sons steal away from camp. They leave in the middle of the night, and they go up this Pottawatomie Creek, and they're stalking. They're looking for pro-slavery forces. They had heard that there were some pro-slavery people who lived in that area, and they were going to look for them and hunt them down. And he and his sons come across... there's also a couple other men with them. I think there was 7 or 8 of them in total. They find some houses along Pottawatomie Creek. And at each, and so they decide these are the pro-slavery forces. And at each house, they go to the house and they interrogate. They literally break into the house at gunpoint, pull people out of their cabins, like the men of the house, and interrogate them. Gun to the face, And they would ask them questions like, hey, what do you know about the killing of anti-slavery forces? Are you pro-slavery? Did you happen to be at the battle over the city of Lawrence? And if John Brown and his sons and the other dudes with him didn't like the answers that they got, they would kill those people. And over the course of the night, they actually killed 5 people. But they didn't just kill them. They, the stories vary. But they some were killed with gunshots, some were killed with swords, some of them were hacked up with broadswords, and they would literally deposit the body parts on the steps of their houses. 5 people in one night, Brown and his band of men killed, and Brown believed that they hadn't even done enough. Brown believed that this score wasn't even because in the city of Lawrence, pro-slavery forces had killed 6 anti-slavery people. And John Brown was like, we're 1 short. Right? That shows you the kind of person that John Brown is. And Brown's, the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre is going to set off one of the bloodiest months of bleeding Kansas. After the massacre, both sides, the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery forces, are going to be enraged at the violence, and they're going to start, and the situation in Kansas gets even more tense. This is not the last time you're going to hear about John Brown. If you're wondering what happened to him, he escapes and goes back to the north, and he's going to kind of move around quite a bit. He's actually going to live with Frederick Douglass for about a month, but we'll talk more about him next time because the end of his life is really fascinating, and so you'll see him again. Next time you see him, he'll have a very long beard. It's kind of remarkable. Let's move on. We'll talk more about them next time. One last election before we finish here, and this is the election of 1856. The election literally right before Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860. All of this, what's amazing to me about the election of 1856 is that all of the violence we've been talking about, the John Brown, the caning of Charles Sumner, all the stuff happening in Kansas, that's all happening in an election year. It's kind of, I'm sure people in 1856 felt similar to what we feel right now in 2020, where there's so much tension happening in the air that it just seems like a super important election. And so there's 3 guys running for, and note, 3 guys running for the election here. And note, we got the new parties. We got the Republicans and the Know Nothings, which also were known as the American Party. Let's start on the left, James Buchanan. James Buchanan is the Democrat. He was a safe pick for the Democrats. He was from Pennsylvania, so he was from the north. But Pennsylvania is a lower northern state, so it's a state that's known for its ties to, it's a state that's not as abolitionist heavy as Massachusetts. And Buchanan was known for his ties to the South, right? So he had a friendly relationship with Southerners. So he was seen as a very safe pick, someone who could win support in both the North and the South. John Fremont is a Republican. He is from California. California, brand new state, almost 1850. John Fremont was a Republican, and he was for a free Kansas. He was against the expansion of slavery. Fremont was a kind of a celebrity politician in a way. He was young, he was dashing, good looking. He was a kind of a heroic type of figure. In fact, he had been one of the people who, the way he became famous was he became famous as an explorer of the West. He was one of those people who had gone through the wilderness and kind of charted the Western territories. And in fact, he got a nickname for it. His nickname was the Pathfinder. And normally people with really cool nicknames do well in American politics, but this time not quite. The other guy is actually a former president. It's Millard Fillmore, who's running for the Know-Nothings. This is kind of an awkward marriage. Millard Fillmore is an odd choice for them. He'd been a former president. He'd been a Whig, and there were some Whigs in the Know-Nothings, but it's kind of like an awkward marriage here. The Know-Nothings had lost some members to the Republicans, but they were still a powerful party in the large New England cities, or large like northern cities. Here's how the election breaks down. The Democrats sweep the South. They even win a lot of this like upper South kind of Midwestern region and Pennsylvania, where James Buchanan is from. But look at the Republicans. They win the entire New England region, plus a lot of these free states up here, states that had never had slavery. Weirdly, John Fremont loses his home state of California, which is kind of awkward. But look at the reason why this election is so interesting. It's the Republicans' first attempt at winning any sort of national election. And they really could have done it. The Republicans could have actually won this election, but for the American Know-Nothing Party. Look at how much of a percentage they get. The Know-Nothings win almost 880,000 votes. And if the Know-Nothings didn't exist, a lot of those votes would have most likely gone to Republicans, like to John Fremont. And it's possible that in their very first election, the Republicans actually win the presidency. But they don't, right? Because the Know-Nothings are there, the Republicans lose and give their and the Democrats take control of the government. And the reason why this is important is because James Buchanan, we'll flip back and look at his picture. There are scholars, historians, political scientists who rank the presidents from like best to worst, right? Like, so you start off with number 1 and then go down to number 45. The top 5 is always like kind of the same dudes. It's like, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, who else? Abraham Lincoln, like Franklin Roosevelt, like those types of figures, like the big names in American history that like everybody knows. James Buchanan is often seen as the worst president in American history. He's always either at the bottom, and usually is at the very bottom, or near the very bottom. And part of the reason why he's considered such a bad president is because he did literally nothing to stop the slide to the Civil War. I know we're running out of time, so let me give you a brief example of what I mean. Kansas, at the time, was still committing, there's still widespread violence happening in Kansas, and now James Buchanan has to deal with this. And the pro-slavery forces in Kansas that had won those fraudulent elections are trying to gain entry to the United States as a state. They're petitioning for statehood. And so they drew up this constitution called the Lecompton Constitution, which was where they wrote it. Lecompton was like one of the strongholds of the pro-slavery forces. And the Lecompton Constitution was vehemently pro-slavery. It even excluded residence for free black people. So like black people weren't even allowed to live in Kansas under this constitution. And the thing is that all of the elections up to this point in Kansas had been corrupted by violence and false voting. Remember, the idea was supposed to be popular sovereignty, that people who lived in Kansas would vote, but the votes had been tampered with. And Buchanan, for some reason, decides that, like, this is fine. And he actually supports the Lecompton Constitution, even though it was clearly made fraudulently, and that the elections in Kansas were all fraudulent. James Buchanan is still like, this is fine. And he supports it and takes it to Congress and is like, yeah, you guys should let Kansas in as a slave state. And people are like shocked. Even Stephen Douglas, who is a Democrat, someone in his own party, was like, dude, we can't support this thing. Like, the Kansas elections have been a mess. Like, there's no, and so Kansas doesn't become a state, and it doesn't pass Congress, which is a huge blow for James Buchanan, because it's like one of the first things he does as president, and it's like a huge misstep. And not only that, but the problem in Kansas are going to continue on. So James Buchanan's a mess and a disaster. But let me just give you a couple of concluding thoughts before we end here, and that's that over the course of this lecture, what we've really seen is how that sectional split is becoming permanent. That the United States is divided by political party, right? The Republicans and the Democrats. The United States is divided into like North and South, and the political parties are kind of like filtering into the North and South as well. There's resentment lingering over the Compromise of 1850. And so all told, the polarization in the country is getting worse, right? People are feeling more separated, more divided, not less. And violence has already started breaking out in pockets of the country. Like Charles Sumner got beaten up on in the halls of Congress. Violence clearly happening in Kansas, and it's going to get worse by the day. And think about this is the environment that exists when Abraham Lincoln is going to get elected, right? This moment where the country is at a fever pitch of division, and and Abraham Lincoln is going to have to step in and try to fix this problem. So that's where we are in this lecture. Remember that next Thursday is the Frederick Douglass book test. On Tuesday, we're supposed to be doing more sectionalism stuff. I'll figure out exactly what we're going to do in that class. I think we're probably going to talk about Abraham Lincoln. I don't have any other announcements. If you have any questions, throw them in the chat, or you can send me an email. That's no problem either. So thank you guys for watching. I'm sure that you guys have had, as I have, a semi-stressful week if you've been paying attention to politics or even just dealing with classwork. I know for you guys, the online class stuff is probably tiring as it is for me. So if you're struggling, let me know, we can try to work through it. But again, thank you guys for showing up, and I always appreciate it when you guys watch my videos and tune in and occasionally chat with me in the chat. So thank you guys again, and I'll see you guys next